All right, guys, in today's video, what we're going to be doing is the result of a couple of years of going through a number of PF52 oil filters and going ahead and seeing how they compare. First, I'll take you through how they compare externally and give you some history on the part number Supersession, and then we'll go through and cut these open and see how they compare internally. But what we have here today is just about every single iteration of this filter design from General Motors. All right, here's a timeline of the part numbers involved in this oil filter series. The very first PF52 was the 2501-2760. Came out in 1993 as this filter was introduced for the 1994 model year. Was very quickly replaced by the 2516-0560 in 1994. And that also was then quickly replaced temporarily with the 1255-5891. I'm going to show you a service bulletin coming up here in a moment indicating that they were having trouble with the anti-drain back valve design on these first two, and they ended up actually using Fram filters at the dealerships for a short period of time until that was corrected by the AC oil filter division. That got corrected in 1996 with the 2517-1377. That filter carried on for a good length of time until 2009 when the PF52E was introduced, originally as the 1921-0286, but they also kept the older design going, which they referred to as the Classic, as the 1925-6043. That Classic design ran until the inventory was out sometime during the pandemic, but the PF52E continued on for quite some time and is still available today as the 1273-7090. The blue text would indicate the part numbers that are currently available. There was also an UltraGuard Gold version, the UPF52. Came out in the late 1990s. It's hard to find the exact date for that. 2532-2836 would have been the original number. Maybe sometime around 1998 or 99, I would speculate. That got discontinued briefly in 2003 before it got brought back by popular demand and continued on until shortly after the pandemic when it was replaced by the UPF52R as the 1942-5079, still available today. Finally, there was a DuraGuard Silver series for the 52, the SPF 52. Several numbers of quick succession, 1921-0342 and 2531-9583. Never been able to find examples of these two, but the 2532-5403 was around for the longest time. This line was discontinued due to poor sales in 2003. That 5403 would have been available from 2000 on, so it's the most likely one that someone would have encountered. There was also a bundle packaging called a DuraPack under the PF52F labeling. It corresponded to putting a dozen of the filters we saw on the previous page into a box, starting off with part number 729882 at the launch, and then in the early 2000s, moving to 1249-0148, and then when the E-Core designs, the 52Es came out, the 1921-0338. That continued on for quite some time until shortly at the end of the pandemic, replaced by the 1273-1177, and then just very recently, the 1273-7091, which is basically a dozen of the 7090 filters. There was also a DuraPack 6 that was labeled as the PF52 EP6. That was a 1942-2675, came out when the E-Cores were introduced and then died off sometime shortly before or during the pandemic. There's another number I'm going to show you here, the 1273-1176. So packaging at the top. This was actually sold in a DuraPack type configuration, but wasn't labeled as a 52F. It was just a dozen of these filters, and they're very, very similar to the 0286 design. When we do the cutting open, I will show a 286 that I think is actually one of these 1176s. So they had some confusing numbering going on at some point. This is a PF52M. This is actually an export type filter sold only in Central and South America. 1923-6827. These filters, I could only find the box photo from the pre-2009-ish era, but they continue to be manufactured right up through the pandemic. I think they're still sold today, but I haven't been able to find any more recent packaging for these models. But you can see they're unique in that they have a silk screening instead of a label on them. Here's a shot at a internal kind of parts explosion for the UPF52R, the Ultra Guard Gold. You can see all the different pieces of the design. What they're highlighting here is specific to the construction of the Ultra Guard Gold. When we cut this open, you'll see how this lines up. But what's specifically unique about this series today is that you have the metal end caps around the synthetic filter media, the pleating, and that you also have a pressure relief valve and anti-drain back valve. So you got the valve you see over on the left on the bottom of the filter, and then on towards the top you've got that nitrile looking piece of material. When we cut open the early versions of this PF52s, you're going to notice they don't have a relief valve in their design. And then finally, here's an internal marketing piece of information about the PF52E. What's unique about these is that instead of metal ends to the filter media, it's polyester, and instead of a metal cage supporting the pleats, it's nylon. The relief valve is the same design as we'll see on some of the classic types when we open them up, as well as having an anti-drain back valve. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of those service bulletins I mentioned, and then we'll go ahead and take a look at all these filters before we cut them open. All right, guys, before we walk through all these different filters, I'm going to show you a couple of service bulletin items. This one from April of 1994 is interesting because what it talks about is starting with 1994, which is the model year that the PF52 got introduced. It's just a bulletin pointing out that all of the production line filters, instead of being painted black, were now going to be painted blue. I'll show a picture up here in the upper right of one of these black painted filters. This would have only been on the PF51 that preceded the 52, because by the time this switchover happened, I don't believe any 52s ever got painted black. They would have always been painted blue. But this I thought was interesting to share with you. And another thing they have on here at the bottom is they point out that when you look at the letters that are printed on the top of the filter, if you did have one of these that were production line original, and that would be one of these blue PF52s, it would have OE for original equipment printed as part of that date code on the top of the filter. The next one I want to show you is from October of 1995. Now this is talking about a problem with the engine, a noise with the engine. And there were several different revisions here. But where this ultimately ended up, I thought was very interesting, because what they ultimately ended up advising the dealerships to do was replace the oil filter. And you'll never believe this one if I didn't show it to you. They took a Fram PH3890, stuck a GM part number on it, 1255 5891. Impossible to locate because it was only available for a brief time and only at the dealership, never sold retail. And they told you to use this Fram filter instead of the AC-PF52. And the reason was that the Fram filter provided a superior anti-drain back performance, it had a better valve design. And they determined that was what was causing the clatter on the valve train with these engines. So what they were telling you here is buy those Fram filters locally until August of 95, and then after this you could order them directly from GM parts using this number. This lasted for a little bit and then got replaced. Now another thing I'll show you is right before that happened in June of 94, they were trying to fix this valve problem. So the original 2501 2760, they were replacing with the 2516 0560. And this is where they were trying to fix this drain valve before you saw the other bulletin where they ended up taking another rev to get to that. Another one of these bulletins I thought was useful to share was this AC-Delco one from May of 2009. This was introducing the E-Core line of filters. This was just something they were sending out to all the AC-Delco dealers, letting them know that this was coming. And then this one from November of 2009 was introducing back the classic design. So here's where they were saying that they were reintroducing the regular PF52. They talked about calling that the classic design to distinguish it from the PF52E. So basically these were sold side by side, right? So they were saying that the E suffix versions are still sold, but now the ones without the E suffix for certain models, like the 52, were also going to be made available. And then this last bulletin I'll show you was for November, December 2009. This is something that would have went to the GM dealership parts department, this Tech Connect type of bulletin. This was just some internal design information about the E-cores that's common to all of them, you know, between the shell, the fact that the DuraGuard media is going to have these polyester end pieces, there's going to be a nylon core holding it, and then what the base plate, gasket, and anti-drain valves design would have been. And then they gave the part numbers for these two series. So the classic design here would have been the 6043, and then the 52E. There's actually a typo here. It should say 286 here. So these numbers are backwards. It should be 286, 285, but here it says 285. So it should say 6 there. All right, let's go ahead and start taking a look at the actual filters and line them up. All right, now that we know the history and we know some of the technical details, let's start looking at the actual examples of the PF52 family. Here's the great-granddaddy of them all, the 250-12-760, the flawed one that ended up having to be replaced. This is an example of the packaging that was available on this particular one. So this is back before the days of AC-Delco, when it was just Rochester AC Division or AC Spark Plug Division. There were some beginnings of the AC-Delco type of branding, but it still was prominently the red AC logo that you see here. Made in the USA, as we can see on the bottom of the box. And if we take a look inside, the filters in this time period would have typically been found opened with the top facing down and the label in this direction. So PF52, different kind of labeling. No markings on the top of the cap, so we don't see the production markings we see later. And we see the blue color, like we saw in our service bulletin previously. There's an example of what she looks like on the bottom. She's got a little bit of corrosion, surface corrosion from sitting. And now let's take a look at what she was replaced by. So she was replaced by the 251-6560 edition. So again, very similar packaging, although the DuraGuard labeling, or branding rather, is more prominent in this packaging style. Still made in the USA. And still stored in this type of direction. Label has changed on the filter. Right, so very similar construction. We can't externally see what the design change was. We'll have to rely on when we cut it open to see what the design change was. The 560 was then replaced by the 251-71-377. This is a very nice condition package. No real difference in the packaging, as we can see. Still made in the USA. But now we can start to see some differences in the construction. So the manufacturer that supplied AC with this particular 377 model, we can see that it's got a different kind of outwardly protruding shape here. And I'll show all these side by side in just a moment. Now, then there were changes in just packaging, right? And so then AC-Delco got more prominent, same part number, packaging changed. Some of us will remember this packaging from the 90s. But the filter inside now was stored facing downward, and the label had changed to match that accordingly. Now you can usually find some type of production numbering on top, date codes in most cases. but the bottom really looks the same as the one we just saw. Then we had the introduction of the PF52E, the E-core. So this is the cost-reduced kind of one that I showed you the bulletins on. Same period packaging that we saw for the 377. Much more codes on the top. Made in the USA. Very similar labeling. But now we can see very different supplier to AC-Delco for the bottom. And then that packaging, after we had the PF52E came out, we know that then people complained, and the larger size was reintroduced as the 192-56043. And this is a new number, but same kind of packaging, very similar. And we can see we have yet another supplier at AC-Delco, different kind of shape on the bottom, but we're back to the full height design, right? If we put the E-core and this guy right next to each other, right, very different heights between these two, although they both have the same fitment and application specifications, very different design. Next thing that we would see happen with these is same part numbers, these two, were then replaced by the new kind of packaging that AC-Delco came out with, which would have left us with these two. So we see the same two numbers that we saw before, the 192-10286 for the E and the 192-56043 for the Classic. What's inside the packaging on these? Basically the same filter. So this is more of a marketing change than anything else. Of course, the changes on the filter here are all very much the same. And then what's inside on this one also very similar, very much the same. Right, so we have these marks that help us identify who the supplier was to AC-Delco for these particular oil filters. And then these were all DuraGuards. And so, you know, the DuraGuard labeling got dropped when they went to the professional labeling, but they also introduced the UltraGuard. And so now here's kind of a close cousin, the UPF52, part number 253-22836. And the UltraGuard Gold was more of a premium high-performance filter offering. And this is where we see a reintroduction of the black paint again. Still made in the USA. Gold type of label. Kind of a red colored gasket made of a different material. And this was considered more of a performance offering. This one's discontinued now and replaced by the UPF52R, which is a 194-25-079. So this is the current flavor of the UltraGuard Gold in the PF52 series. We take this guy out again. UltraGuard filters are painted black. You can see this is yet a different supplier. You can note kind of like the perimeter difference, for example. I'll put these all side by side here in a minute. And then we can see the current generation of the 52 that we're left with is just an E-core, which is the 192-10286 again, and this is the most current packaging. So the classic PF52s are gone for good. This is all you can get now. So they've done some relabeling as part of trying to stop Chinese counterfeits. But other than that, it's the same 286 filter we saw earlier. So let's take a look at these side by side. All right, here's a view from the bottoms next to each other. Here's our 250-12-760, the original PF52. And then here's our revised 251-6560. They appear to be the same supplier, although I can see there's more pronounced of a ridge in the plate here on the original 760 than there is here on the 560. Could just be normal manufacturing variances though. And then we have the 377, clearly a different supplier. And then we have just a repackaging change of the 377, and it doesn't really appear to be any difference at all on the repackaging change. Then of course we see a dramatic difference when we look at our E-Core. And then we take a look at our Classic being brought back. This one also definitely has a different supplier, in my opinion, than the 377. As you can see, a very pronounced difference in the two. If you guys know who supplied which ones of these at which times, I'd love to hear it in the comments. And then if we take a look comparing our Ultra Guard, we can see our Ultra Guard is most likely the same supplier as the one next to it, because we also see this stamped TT. You can see right there. And that stamped TT is also present on our 043 Return to the Classic model. And then if we take a look just at looking at the Ultra Guard R, let's move the camera over here just a hair. See, this guy also has the TT stamp. The number of drain holes are different, but it does appear to also be the same supplier that made the original UPF52. So the UPF52 here and the UPF52R here. All right, guys, there's a couple of examples that we couldn't get to the reunion party here. This 1273 1176 box that I took a picture of, this is a 52E. It's an E-Core that's structurally the same as the 0286, but it only sells in a box of 12, kind of like a PF52F Durapack, but it wasn't marketed that way for some reason. So you would get a crate of 12 of these, and they had their own part number, and then in the box they would all be numbered with this number instead of the 0286 number. I'll put a picture up here in the upper right on the label on the packaging for this one. The other one I couldn't get is not sold in the US, and that's the PF52M. This is a Central and South America only type offering. This is the older pre-E-Core type packaging, pre-2009, and then if you took it out of the box, I found some pictures of what's inside. It's silk screened rather than labeled with PF52M. It's going to be, like I said, a pre-E-Core design based on the 1377. This GM number on this guy is 1923-6827. So those are the two we couldn't get. We'll go through all the others and run them through, and then we'll start opening them up. All right, guys, one more late arrival to the family reunion here. 1273-7090 is the current part number on the PF52E. Still this later type of GM World Trade packaging with all the different translations. Still made in the USA, but now it's got this kind of concave kind of design to the bottom. Looks a little bit more robust than the typical E-Core. We can see the valve underneath there, a little bit of markings on there. Looks like AAX, still stamped TT here like some of the earlier ones. And still has this newer guidance about turning it once and torquing to 10 Newton meters to avoid leaks. So this is the last one we'll be putting on, and then we'll go take a look at how all of them compare internally. All right, we're going to start with the 2501-2760. This is the very first PF52. They replaced the PF51. I did not run this one because we saw that we had the bulletin where it caused problems. So let's go ahead and open this guy up and see what the problem was with the anti-drainback valve design that this guy introduced. So this, if you recall, this is the one that had to be redesigned twice before GM got it right. And then in between that, they started recommending the Fram filter. It's not the first time I've used one of these cutters, but I've never ran into one that's so difficult to cut as this guy. I guess we'll just chalk it up to mid-90s American steel. I think we basically got it cut open now. Like I said, I hope they're not all going to be as difficult as this guy. I got just one section here that we didn't get through on the first pass. All right. Let's metal fatigue it the rest of the way. All right, no stampings on this guy, on this lid. There's their anti-drain back valve design. And there's their metal end-capped core. Now this guy got replaced with the 0560. Now these all we felt safe enough to run. They're going to be a little bit more messy to separate. And I guess on this first one I should have pulled the gasket off just so we can see that. All right. So like I said, hopefully we won't have to fight with all of these. Let's see. I guess we might think that that first one is a little thicker. All right, let's see what this design looks like. Pull the gasket off of here if we can. Larger holes. That's one difference we can see. This anti-drain back valve really doesn't look any difference on this side to me, but it's possibly different on this side. Or is this one just compressed? Nope, there's definitely a difference. So we can see that they changed how that appears, but that still wasn't effective because this still had to be replaced with a Fram filter for a short period of time. Got some other kind of change going on here because we can't get this guy to come out. Get some of this oil out of here so it's less messy. Let's see why we can't get this separated. There we go. All right. There's no real reason it was just stuck. No change in the media itself. And so this guy then got replaced, and finally they were able to stop recommending the Fram filters with the 2517 1377. So we'll just go ahead and pull this gasket off right now. Let's see how they change that. So internally, once again, different design on the end. It's got a raised center to it. You can tell that when you look, this is more flat. The first two series were more of a flat design. Got our rag caught in there for a second. It's getting super slippery. I think we got this one done too now. Let's go over it one more time. And let's see if we did. Okay. Just catch some of the oil that's on this piece here. Let's see if we got anything left to dump out. Yep. And so we're just comparing the design here, guys. We're not interested in what got filtered and what the pleats look like, right? This is not a purchase type video because this is all vintage stuff here. All right, this anti-drain back design was the final version. And quite frankly, doesn't look visually any different than the edition that preceded it to me. Maybe a thicker ridge. Yeah, the ridge around here is noticeably thicker than the previous generation. So maybe that was the extent of the change that was required to get this more reliable. Let's try and dump some of this more of this oil out so we have less of a mess. This guy came out a lot nicer. Didn't get stuck. Metal end plates, or end caps rather, on the pleats holding it together. Our sticker on this guy came off, just due to age. Now we have another example of this same part number, like you saw when we walked through it. But really the only difference, I believe, is this label that was printed on here. We really don't see a difference on the design. So I don't see a reason to cut this one open. I don't believe it's going to be any different. It's a marketing change only. So now that gets us up to 2009 and the introduction of the E-Core. And so here's our first one of the 1921 0286 examples. See if we can get our gasket off before we do the cutting. Set that right there. You can start to hear the metal giving way. That's it. So I got a feeling as the more we move towards the present, the easier everything's going to cut open with thinner metal. All right, so the E-Core design, more holes, flatter. Anti-drain back valve, different design entirely. And then we've got something new now that we didn't have on the bottoms of these. We've got this valve that we just drop back inside there. Hold on a second. Again, just trying to minimize some mess here. All right, let's get this guy back out of there. All right, so now we see with this version, we've introduced this valve on the back side. And so just like with the one I showed earlier, I have several more examples that we showed of this 286 series, but I believe them to be all the same and just differences in supplier. Although this one does look a little different. We might take a look at this guy, right? There's an opening around here, so this one may be a little bit of a different design, as well as this one here. Again, just a change to add a torque value like we talked about earlier. I don't think these two are any different, but we'll open this one up because it does look a little bit different than the one that we already did. And then this last one that we had was, again, a different package, but still looks to be the same design. So let's see if this one's any different, just because when we look at the lid here, there is a difference in this opening. Let's take our gasket off. Set that right there. Let's see if we got anything to come out of here. Yep, just a little bit. There goes our metal. Okay, I think that's it. Let's see. Nope, a little bit here that we missed. Makes it difficult to crank it open. All right. Right, so a little bit of a difference there. More holes on the back side, so this is definitely a slightly different design, even though the part number was not changed. Usually whenever there's any change in supplier or design, GM will rev the part number. Little piece of the label that got cut off there. But still the same polyester ends on the pleats. And still the introduction of this valve. All right, who's next? Well, next up would be the Classic Edition. So this would be the 1925 6043 when they brought back this classic design. Let's knock some of this oil out of here. So we can see this is not at all like the previous classic design. It is a different supplier. So let's see how it varies internally. Towel in there. I think we're done. Once again, we missed a little piece on this edge. It makes it difficult for us to keep going. I think we got it now, though. All right. So yeah, different design here. Stamped TT for the OEM that supplied AC-Delco with this. Yet another anti-drain bag valve design. Let's go ahead and dump this out. And yet another valve design on the back side that I'll show you here in just a second. Oh well, we'll fetch that. All right, so this supplier used a different shape for the valve in the back here. When we look at the others of this classic design series, the 6043, we really don't see any difference. This one's also stamped TT, so just a label change, so that's just a marketing difference. And then this one here, also stamped TT, just a marketing difference with the indication of how tight to tighten it. So we won't open these because they're just marketing differences. Well guys, let me insert this little clip here. When we got done with this video, I decided to cut all of those filters open that looked like they had only marketing differences. And this one 6043 with this particular style label, because otherwise externally it was identical, and all the other parts were identical, but it did have a different design for the bypass valve. This one particular one had one shape like this. So I thought I would share that with you. All the others were in fact just marketing differences and had no differences on the internal design. the last one we have, and this is the one that is currently, at the time of this video, being sold, is this 1273-7090. We can see it's very different. Stamped TT, but very deep dish design here. And this gasket is much thicker than any of the previous generations. Let's go ahead and open this guy up. And this will be the last one for the base PF52, and then I'll show you a couple of the PF52 Rs, or the UPF52s rather. I'm very curious to see what has changed inside here. So they still use the E suffix for this one, but I seriously doubt it's going to have the polyester type design of the earlier E-Core. Okay, that's it for this one. All right, so there's the shape of our end piece. It's retaining, oh no, it's actually yet another anti-drain bag valve design. And then much to my surprise, it does have polyester end caps on the pleats. Interesting. So that means they're still using that. And then on the very end, it's still keeping this valve, but it looks like it's gone back to the same design used in the other E-Cores. All right, there's all of the regular PF52s. Let me take a moment, clean this up, and then what we'll do next is we'll take a look at the two Ultra Guard edition ones. We've got the first generation, the 2532, 2836. And then the last one we'll show today in this video is the current one that replaced that, which is the UPF52R, the 1942 5079. So let me clean some of this up. We'll do these two, and we'll call it a wrap. All right, we cleaned up some of this so things are easier to see. So definitely can see the progression of anti-drain back valve designs as we go across this family of the base PF52. We can also see the transition from metal end caps to polyester, back to metal, then finally staying with polyester today. We can see the introduction of a bypass valve with the 286, and then a different design for this 6043, and then the current 7090, yet another design that's back to what we had with the 286. Let's go ahead and take a look at these two Ultra Guards. So these were all DuraGuards. Let's take a look at these Ultra Guard filters. So slightly different gasket material. Let's go ahead and pull these off now. These are a little harder to get off with your fingers, so I had a little pick out here anticipating that problem. All right, let's look at the first one. So this would have been the 2836. This was the first of the UPF 52s. We'll open this guy up. Is our metal starting to give? Okay. All right, and we can see the end is stamped TT. I believe this is an indicator that it's from the same supplier as some of the 52s that we looked at that have that same stamping. Trying to keep everything nice and clean. Very different design though on the underside to the DuraGuards. Let's get our anti-drain back valve off. So we can see this anti-drainback valve similar to what we saw on the Classic series. Not quite the same though, but similar. Our filter media is also very similar with this raised end to what we saw on the Classic series. Let's go ahead and dump off some of this excess oil. Reduce our mess. Go ahead and let that drain out there while we extract our bypass valve. Bypass valve design different than any of the ones that we saw in the DuraGuard series. All right, so it looks like that. Okay. And then just again to cut down the mess, we'll let the filter media drain out while we move ahead to this guy, which is the current UPF number. Last one. I do believe the shell is slightly thicker steel on these Ultra Guards compared to the DuraGuards. Cutting through now. I think we got just one piece. There we go. That's it for the cutter today. If you're interested in a cutter like this, I'll put a link down in the video description. I like this particular one. I've had it for a few years now. In this case, everything is being held together by the anti-drainback valve. Get some of the mess out of here. Again, stamped TT, which again I believe indicates the same supplier as we've seen for some of these different designs. Let's remove this anti-drainback valve. Compare it to the previous edition. It is a different design. Let's go ahead and bring our media back from the first one. And then we'll dump our excess oil. We'll pick up that bypass valve in just a moment. Let's go ahead and get this shell wiped off, and we'll sit it back here with the other one. Now we can see that our bypass valve has changed design yet again back to what is used on the E-core of the DuraGuards. All right, so taking a look at our 7090, it is the exact same design compared to the predecessor. The UPF52 was this design. The UPF52R is reusing that E-core design, and then bringing over our filter media. We can definitely see there's a difference in the size of this media. That's something to take note of. The previous one was pleats were longer, very similar to the DuraGuards, but this UPF52R, it's noticeably shorter in height. All right, that's it, guys. I've given you the world tour for the PF52 from birth until, well, it's still around today. It hasn't died yet. But you've seen a lot of different designs. There's been a few we could not get today that I referenced for you, like the Mexican, the PF52M. Then there was the ones that come in the Durapacks are really just 12 of one of these type, depending on the numbers I showed you earlier, as well as that one oddball one that I showed you, that 1273, 1176, I believe. They didn't call it a PF52F. They just kept the E designation. If you had some questions about what I showed you today, or you got some comments, or maybe you've got some examples of these filters that somehow escaped my research, I'd love to hear about it in the comments below. If you got something you want to share question-wise, you can leave that below as well, and I'll try to help answer those questions as best I can from the research I have. I hope you found this interesting. I hope you learned something. If you did, I'd appreciate you paying it forward by hitting that like button. And as always, thanks for watching.